simple. That was quite a mouthful. So as Tipo said, I've been in the banking industry for many years. I wouldn't give my age away. I was an executive at Standard Bank, and for about 12, 14 years before I left the bank, and I headed up private banking South Africa and business banking South Africa. And what intrigued me to actually do my PhD at this stage, when I completed my MBA in about 8-9 years ago, I did it through Hindi, and at that point in time they invited me to actually do a PhD, and I wasn't really interested. You know, my kids said, "Mom, do it, you'll have a title behind your name," and for me it wasn't the time, and I wasn't interested because I wanted to do something with purpose. And when I joined Cornerstone, first of all, I had found my purpose, because it's a platform, it's an environment where we actually give back to learners in the banking industry. So most of us are banking specialists. We specialize in the financial industry, and I do mostly the strategic consulting with excos of multiple banks. So having come from one institution, your eyes sort of go wide. But as you consult, you realize in the financial sector as such, everyone has a similar problem. Different color, same problem. I always said that one must never say never, but I always say that I wouldn't really leave one bank from an employment perspective to another, because it's really, same politics, different color. And I think in terms of problem statements in the financial sector, whether I'm engaging with Capitec or Standard Bank or FNB or Nedbank, and having conversations with Discovery as they're thinking about their banking proposition, etc., the problems are always essentially the same. So my PhD, I'm actually I know Zain said just 18 months. He's sort of the opinion you should be completed with it already. For me, I'm at the embryonic stages, because it really takes one about 3 to 4 months to crystallize your problem statement, to really crystallize what it is that you're wanting to do your research on. And for me, the reason why it took me that long is because I'm a practitioner, I'm not an academic. And I wanted to find the balance between academia and being a practitioner, in that I wanted to ensure the rhythm and the rigor from an academic perspective applies within the PhD. But at the same time, I wanted a layman, a practitioner, to, open my paper and be intrigued and read through it and start changing their philosophy potentially and their methodologies in terms of how they actually enable business through applied learning. So in sort of setting that scene, I've used a specific case study, to actually test the hypotheses. And in essence, I started off with getting a real good understanding with what the likes of McKinsey, KPMG, PwC, all the Deloitte, all the fundamental specialists from a research perspective. I wanted to really get a sense of what their thoughts were around 21st century banking, and also what will banks actually look like in beyond 2020. Because one often talks about branches actually not having its place. You're going to have a whole lot of disruptors coming, and the whole banking environment is really going to evolve from a digital perspective. And it was quite interesting in that the research actually demonstrated that there will be an element of disruption from a digital perspective, okay? But the reality is what remains at the core in the heart of banking is a client-centric solution. And everything then revolves around the client in terms of how one derives a product, how one actually positions a marketing strategy, how one actually positions a client value proposition all through the mouth and the eyes of the client. I think what organizations also fail to realize to a large extent, and my research is specifically within the financial sector, is that our conversation around market research, there's most certainly a time and a place for market research, but we as individuals who head up organizations, we fail to realize the actual tangible benefit of our people in the front line. They essentially are our researchers. They are essentially our change ambassadors. They are essentially the individuals who can set us apart from the rest of our communities, and we actually underestimate that value. So people spend a lot of time in their ivory towers and they make decisions, but they fundamentally forget about the strength of the workforce in the environment. So the reality with just the research in terms of how disruptive banking is actually going to be beyond 2020. There's no rocket science. There's really not going to be huge disruptions as such. The client still remains at the core. Client experience is still fundamentally the flavor to actually grab and to hold market share. And also what's going to be particularly important is for organizations who are going to survive beyond 2020, it's for them to start listening to the client, to create products and solutions that actually benefit the client and not actually throw clients in segments. So with a concentrated banking population, with a battle for main banked clients, we have literally 4 or 5 main banks that we all know about. But the reality is that you have 17 banking licenses in South Africa. You're getting 2 more. So competition is ripening, but your unbanked population is actually expanding. Your bank population is concentrating, your unbanked is expanding. So banks to a large extent are actually fighting and grabbing market share. There's a huge desire to increase revenue, but therein lies the difficulty. And then client loyalty is an issue. Because let's be honest, I mean, even coming from an environment, an emerging market environment, we generally banked with whom our parents banked with. If there was a sense of loyalty, that's whom we banked with. And today, that's not a thing. It was actually a cultural thing that if my dad banked with Standard Bank, then I would bank with Standard Bank. And today, individuals actually make their own choices. So the element of client loyalty is actually not prevalent at all. So I then looked at one particular bank, and as I said, this really expands across the banking sector in terms of problem statement. In that this particular bank actually is one of the 5 big banks in South Africa. They have a strategic intent of acquiring 20% market share. So 20% market share, which translates to approximately 5 million clients by 2020. Okay, at the current growth rate, the business will fall short quite significantly, of the actual required or the strategic intent. And interestingly, Tanya, from a marketing point of view, 780 million rand was actually spent in retail and relationship banking, and this is the core capability in terms of acquiring market share. So 780 million rand, which was a big chunk of the marketing budget, was spent in this environment. But the marketing strategy didn't really realize business. So the marketing strategy was quite not aligned with the strategic intent. And therein lies a problem in that when you look at a business holistically and you have a strategic intent, every component has to align to that strategic intent in order for you to realize benefit. So I then had multiple conversations with executives in this particular organization, and they all basically said that they believe they have the right product, that the product is in the right place. They were not wanting to be an innovative bank in terms of fundamentally having very exciting intrinsic complementary products. They believed that their service ethic would actually have held them in good stead. They were unconvinced that their longer term value would actually be gained from their sales efforts. and that will translate into business results. So everyone in the ivory tower said we're creating the right product, we're pricing it correctly, we're marketing it correctly, but it's people in the front line that are not doing their jobs. And so what are you doing with the people in the front line to actually do their jobs? What do you expect of them? What do you want them? Have you invested in them? What is the culture looking like, etc.? Okay, so the point of sale was identified as the main concern of business and of the business challenge. And all the executives unanimously said in the research that there was not sufficient value conversations. Okay. And that there was a definite requirement from an L&D perspective on getting the sales team to actually become enablers. But the organization actually didn't really understand what needed to be done. So the executives were of the opinion it was the front line. And in consultation with business, we realized, the feedback that I had given to them is that they had a huge gap in terms of their strategy. Because they had a strategy that was well defined, but none of the other components were actually aligned to that strategy. So, for example, they were measuring they were measuring NII and NIR, but they were driving widgets. So they're measuring value, but they're driving volume. So therein, lied the biggest disconnect. In an environment such as that, because they were in retail banking fundamentally was attracting their biggest margin and had a strong skew in terms of, the proportion towards their holistic financial income. They actually had not even considered looking at the middle market. So from an organic growth perspective, they were actually ignoring a market that was the sweetener in this particular environment. So from a strategic point, so their strategy wasn't well defined. They had no thoughts around disruptive CDPs because they wanted sort of a one-size-fits-all, which fundamentally was not aligned to what their client needed. Measurement, as I said, was one of the key issues. So they were talking value, but they were driving volume. So therein lied the biggest disconnect. And no wonder everyone actually said that the front line wasn't doing what they needed to do because the front line was fundamentally confused. Okay? From a cultural point of view, there was a huge dissonance in that because of the method of measurement, their culture was a very punitive culture. And as a result, sales consultants actually believed that if they were offered a sales consultant role, it was really to get them to exit from the organization. So being in a sales environment was no longer aspirational in this context. The sales individuals were completely despondent. Those who actually did well at selling had left selling because they were feeling exceptionally vulnerable in that they were the target for performance management, etc. And they went and found other roles, perhaps within the organization or even beyond. So the tenor and the actual, the tenor, eroded quite significantly, but also the actual skill set within this environment actually just, imploded over a short period of time. Then you looked at remuneration. So remuneration was also quite an issue because there wasn't, from a point of reward and recognition, there wasn't an alignment to the task and what the organization actually wanted to achieve. And then systems and processes. The organization were of the opinion that their systems were completely streamlined, that they were effective, that they were enabling the front line, and it was absolute the opposite because their systems were actually complicating the front line to such an extent that when they looked at predictive tools, predictive modeling, if anyone sat in front of a consultant, the consultant would have like 2 pages of opportunities to actually discuss with the client. And when does one have time when you have a small window of opportunity to sell and you actually managed by your manager from a productivity perspective in terms of how quickly do you actually turn the queues. So therein lied the issue. from an L&D perspective, L&D had very little muscle in the process. And I think in most environments, L&D had actually become order takers. They were taking instructions from business and they weren't actually influencing the process. And the executive who was actually the loudest in terms of what they wanted always got what they wanted from L&D. So the learning within the L&D context was not learning within a mediated environment. It was just a regurgitation of content. And when one goes through a process when you have to regurgitate content, and then you have to accredit yourself by huge volumes of portfolios of evidence, you actually lose spirit in the process. So the entire L&D capability was not where it should have been. So this was really, so I've given the organization feedback, and my work stream, I said to them, is I would look at the L&D capability, and this is really the essence of the PhD. The organization then went and they started different work streams in terms of looking at disruptive CVPs, aligning all of the components to the intended strategy, starting to create a different culture, especially within the sales environment, looking at rewarding and recognizing in a very different manner. They also changed their whole scorecard from a measurement point of view, because now you no longer measured your frontline just on widgets. It was, an operating income element that was coming into that environment. So my particular work stream that I focused on was, so how do we change behavior through an applied learning methodology within this environment? Can we do it? And what are the components that are actually going to influence the success of that? And I use the contextual framework of the Aberdeen group, in that the research that actually had culminated from this piece of work was that knowledge is the enabler for success, and learning is vital for organizational survival and prosperity. And the crux of this research also suggested that for an environment to actually have a competitor differentiator, okay, the competitor differentiator is going to be based on how they enable their business or their team to structured learning. But structured learning actually needs to be supported, and at that point in time, one didn't realize what it actually needed to be supported on. So through the research, the Aberdeen group actually consulted with 535 human resources, individuals, which included learning, people from learning and development, line of business and professionals, and they actually did quite a lot of in-depth assessments in terms of the process, procedures and methodologies and technologies in terms of what actually creates competitor differentiation. And competitor differentiation was really boiled down to how do we enable our teams by giving them the right sets of tools, but by giving them the right sets of tools in an enablement environment. Okay, and how do we educate them as such? The other element was the fundamental importance of the top-down approach. So from a change management perspective, one needs to change from the top. And we talk about how different change management processes work. Some believe that when you buy any specific solution, there's a lot of focus at that point in time because all the executives are wanting to get involved. They look at it from a pricing point of view, etc. As soon as it's signed up, guess what? It's actually left into pure execution, and therein lies a problem. And then also, it's really about the competitor advantage for any organization to survive would be building leadership competencies to enable the workforce, and that's one of the fundamental drivers. So my research objective was then really understanding the business problem and with that business problem defined, and client value being projected as one of the key factors for survival in this particular institution in 2020. The focus was then on learning solutions and how we were going to use these learning solutions to enable the sales force was actually quite paramount in solving this particular problem. So the research, in essence, is aimed at exploring how applied learning can change the behavior of a consultant from volume to value selling, and how leaders use the concepts of learning, especially from this particular program, to enable their teams to have these value conversations. And that is where the sustainability of the learning actually emerges. Okay? So the objective of my study was really to critically test the hypothesis that applied learning is a key strategic driver to meet business objectives. And through critically evaluating the hypotheses, I really needed to establish, so what are the fundamental drivers for designing a sales learning program that will have a direct impact on business results? Why is a leader-led approach important with the learning context, and how does it translate into sustainable business growth? What are the roles of knowledge workers as enablers in executing a learning program designed for application? And what enabling tools are most fitting to measure business impact? So that's really what I needed to critically, assess. And at just this juncture, I'll just pause and also say to you that when I was asked to actually present at Curiosita, I was like, oh my God, I mean, what are they doing? I'm, at my infancy stages of my PhD, really. But on reflection, I was just chatting to Mark, I think it's actually easier, it's better to have the conversation at this time of your PhD, because as you project what your objectives are, as you project the aim of your study, it is the information, or rather the input from individuals of yourself, that actually gives the researcher comfort in that they're on the right track, or maybe just more curiosity about exploring different contexts and different environments. So the research design is of a qualitative nature. We are really looking at evaluating the extent to which leaders and consultants have put what they learned into practice, into everyday work. So the application aspect for me is the most important. I mean, we look at research all the time, and we know that only 10% of what you've learned in the classroom really resonates with the learner. It's how it's applied that's fundamentally important. But I wanted to really evaluate what are the key issues, the key elements of application that would actually set the learner up for success. Okay. I also wanted to test with the design, because from a design point of view, and if you are designing for self-efficacy, if you're designing for personal significance, if you're designing to change behavior and mindsets from volume to value, naturally you want to test if there was actually an improvement in the individual's confidence, in their self-efficacy, in how they deem their personal significance within the role. Okay. I also wanted to test the importance, if there was an improvement in terms of planning, contextual awareness, and value focus. And then also the outcomes of the quality and frequency of the sales behavior coaching by the sales leaders was also important to me, and the development of the leadership skills needed to drive the execution. So that's really what I actually wanted to evaluate, which brings me then to the conversation around my contextual framework. And when I looked at my contextual framework, I looked at what are the factors in terms of enabling learning. And I think what's nice about a contextual framework is that the researcher defines their contextual framework. If you look at your knowledge competency framework, that has to be tested against theories, against academics, etc. When you look at your contextual framework, you can actually explore, and your conclusion may not be the model that you actually anticipated when you put your contextual framework together. So my contextual framework is really about the design. So the components of the design within the context of applied learning. What are the fundamental elements that one actually needs to keep in mind? And I just may be a bit ambitious as I go through the process, because within the contextual framework, I may create another contextual framework specific for design, where I'll look at Bloom's taxonomy, and I'd look at Cole, and I'd look at the PACE, the sort of the PACE capability, and integrate that into another conceptual framework within design. So it is ambitious, but it's something that I'm definitely wanting to explore. And then I'm looking at change management, but change management specifically in terms of top management. How do they actually take on the role of change ambassadors? Should they? Okay. And then also exploring within the contextual framework execution. So execution from the concept of adoption, and then very importantly, the middle manager. So what is the role of the middle manager, and how does that middle manager influence and enables the actual sales force? So the qualitative study will be targeted at 70 consultants and 50 leaders. So it's quite a big sample size. The intention is to use Brinkerhoff's methodology in terms of purposeful sampling, where individuals will, in essence, be tested on knowledge and cognitive absorption of the actual program, and I'll use that data to select my sampling, and then obviously go into the qualitative research. I'm looking at about an hour's worth of in-depth interviews, but on a very structured basis, because I'm wanting to actually see emerging themes. And that's the reason why I'm looking at research of that nature. Also, what's important to me is the fact that I also want to keep this research as unbiased as I possibly can, because I am a practitioner, and I also have come in with my own mindsets, and I've come in with my own logics into writing the paper. So in order to actually mitigate, my biases in the process, I am going to do some of the interviews, but I am going to bring in field workers, field researchers that will do the research. And if it's on a structured basis, I'm quite confident that I'd actually be able to pick up, the desired themes. What will be quite interesting is actually getting to that sample size in terms of learner participation, because I suppose that's always the biggest issue. But the organization has actually given me the comfort that they will drive that they will drive participation. So as I unpack my contextual framework, when I look at design, I've looked at the findings of Cross, I've looked at Knowles to a large extent, and I've looked at Halton, who actually provided quite useful sources in consideration design when one looks at adult learning. And the assumptions on adult learning really focuses on learners' independence, their experience, their motivation to learn, the problem and the task-centeredness, and their need for immediate practical application of their learning. So it brings together quite a nice, interesting conversation around design that has to be structured but loose enough to accommodate learning that will be taking place amongst peer groups. And I think that's fundamentally quite rich learning, and it may sound quite basic, but within the context of practice, it isn't a phenomenon that's widely implemented. So that's what I'm actually going to be looking at. Then also drawing from the literature of adult learning, I think some common threads were drawn together for the use of the broadness of definition in terms of social, flexible, and dynamic natures of adult learning. The adoption in terms of how do you actually design for adoption, I think work integrated learning really is a concept that's been well researched, and it provides the students with access to real world experiences, and it allows for the application of theory and practice. I think how it's executed is going to be the fundamental the fundamental core of the success of a program of this nature. And just in terms of a lot of the research that I've done through Singe, the learnings transfer, he says, can actually be considered as one of the most fundamental cornerstones in the establishment of a learning organization, and using that as an enabler of the organization to use learned knowledge, skills, and behavior that's acquired during the learning event that creates that sustainability within the organization. So the contextual framework from a design point of view is really just about how one designs in the spirit of enablement and in the spirit of ensuring that application drives business results. When one looks at change management and culture, and I'm just going to talk, I know Sipho says that time's of the essence, so I'm just going to talk broadly around here. It's the role of middle management within the context of hierarchies. So how does the middle manager, who is literally the ham in the sandwich, that needs to become an enabler in learning, but has the voice of the leaders regarding what they want you to achieve, how does that middle manager actually, keep all the balls in the air, and how do they demonstrate their behavior and their commitment to their team in an ethical manner, bearing in mind that they also have reporting lines, etc. So therein lies quite a strong dichotomy around, the middle manager who actually has a commitment to the learner, to their team, and the commitment to their leadership, and how do they navigate through that process. So, there's quite a lot of research around that aspect, but I'm not going to go into it in the interest of time. And then when one goes really into middle management, it's about using middle management as the first line of defense as an enabler, and how does one actually drive that that behavior. So it brings me to a very interesting concept that I've started exploring through Ruben Fruestein in terms of mediated learning, and Fruestein actually says that mediated learning has to have an element of intentionality. So when one looks at intentionality, one actually looks at how does each individual or different individuals within that contextual framework, how do they fundamentally create the role and project the role as a mediator in the learning journey? And one will unpack. So within my studies, I'm going to unpack every aspect within the contextual framework and the role of the mediator within that framework. So with a mediated learning experience, Ruben uses quite an interesting example where he says that parents, sort of a set of parents took their child with them when they traveled extensively, and they were of the opinion that just having their child with them was good enough. But when the child was asked about all the travels, because he traveled the world, he couldn't really give context to much of what he had seen or what he had observed, because the parents really were of the opinion having the kid with them through their travels was good enough. They weren't the mediator of learning. They never pointed certain things out to the kid. They never directed that particular, depth of knowledge. So one needs to be very, very clear about that role of the mediator and what one wants the mediator to project and what one would want the mediator to execute. I think what's also important in mediator is the nature of transcendence. So it's really about going beyond your immediate experience, and it's how you pose the learning capability. So if you look at a stone in a Scorpio scenario, it's around saying to an individual, so what have you actually learned by being careful not to turn the stone around? Okay, as opposed to saying to an individual, there's a scorpion under the stone. So it's a very transcending nature of how one positions the learning methodology, and then also the mediation of meaning. So it's really experiencing the significance around a particular experience. So when the parents took the kid on their trips, they never explored the significance of that experience. For the child, it was just getting on the plane and going to another place. It was really, there wasn't, the richness of that experience that was exploited to any extent. And then enabling your business through applied learning, and everyone asks the question of what's the return on investment. And a lot of studies have actually demonstrated that when one looks at return of investment within a learning capability and you look at a financial model, there's a myth. It's a myth that you will see a return on investment which is isolated only in terms of the financial benefit. Okay? One needs to look at components in terms of the financial, the human, the time resources, and then also understand what was the bigger drive, because your biggest drive in terms of any enablement capability is how one actually translates behaviors to habits. And that is a sustainable, criteria within applied learning. So I think managerial support for applying the skills, learning in training and enabling training by many researchers has really been, one of the criteria for sustainable learning. What's interesting, and I'm sure you would share your experiences, is how many of the managers actually do that, how many leaders actually do that. And in this very structured environment where all of these elements were taken into consideration in the case study, I'm actually going to test for the outcomes, and I will triangulate the shift of the behavior of the consultant, the leader-led approach, and the actual financial results, and actually see if there is any correlation within that. Okay. What's exciting about the study, and we don't have time, so I won't show you the interview, is that through my research, I've actually applied the whole leader-led approach, mediated learning experiences in vocational learning. So, I intended showing you an interview where we started taking a very structured approach and moving it, a structured leader-led approach, and moving it into vocational training. And in this particular environment, it is one of the bigger retail banks as well. And when they started, their journey of learning, they said that their learners would actually learn by themselves. Their intelligence will develop. And Piaget actually talks a lot about, Piaget's philosophy is around individuals actually mature their intelligence with their own experiences, etc. I think he's quite isolated because I haven't found any other research that actually supports that, that theory that one doesn't need human intervention to exploit learning capability. But anyway, in this particular organization, they followed those principles. And we ran a learnership with them. And participation was, at around 38%, which was crazy. It was level 5 learnership, there was cross-subsidizing their learners, and it just wasn't working because they were adamant that they did not want any form of mediation. We then, I then looked at the whole process, and I started engaging them on a leader-led approach and how we can bring in mediated learning through a structured environment without time impositions to their to their leaders. And the results have actually been quite significant in that from a 38% participation, we now have in excess of 87% participation. That's all because we introduced the concept of mediation. So I think what's exciting about my PhD as well is that my research isn't static. But as I pick up on things, I actually can apply it in what it is that I do on a day-to-day basis, and influence mindsets, within the financial sector as well. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And
for sure.
yeah, there's lots of work to be done, as with any PhD. But I will certainly welcome your thoughts and your inputs.
Yes, Mahlatsi.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm glad I came.
Thanks.
And hopefully we'll have time to see what you wanted to show us. I'm sitting here. I do coaching, so I'm in the learning space, and I wish the research was already ready for me to use. And here's my question. I didn't hear you refer to selection of the people in any way. And one of the things that I've been finding in this particular client is that, so for instance, I speak to the CEO, and the CEO knows what needs to happen, but the capacity of the rest of the marshals is very low, and in some cases where people are said to be smart, their attitude is extremely inappropriate. So obviously, in their case, they spend a lot of money on training, on traditional training, and it has not yielded fruit, and that's why we were called to do coaching.
Yes.
But I find that one of the problems is the gatekeeping. Is if wrong people come into the organization, they undo a lot of what has been done. In fact, one of our best institutions, the CEO just resigned, and the new CEO has undone a lot of good work. So I wonder if in terms of your work, you will be looking at isolating or identifying the kinds of people that the organization needs, as opposed to just focusing on learning.
Yes.
For the ones
So maybe that's for my next PhD. It's really selection. Recruitment is not part of it, because my reality is that you have legacy systems, you have people who are in the environment, and what do you do with them? How do you enable them? So for me, it's more about that development and setting people up for success to do their jobs. But just to comment on you in terms of the conversations with the CEO, because we also found I found in much of my consulting, and also being a business head, very often the CEO buys into the project, into a particular solution. The line managers or their layer below only understand the contextual implications of it, because they don't have time to buy into it, and then they don't drive the actual methodology and the intent with their staff. So it's really about change management that starts at the CEO and then their direct reports, because whatever you do, you need to showcase it. We cannot assume, and we make that mistake, that by drafting fancy communications or getting a channel head to read through a script and then projecting it in all the internal networks, that's change management. We thought that was it in this case as well, but that's not it. So in order to actually drive adoption, we had to go back, and we had to go into all the mancos, and we had to actually showcase. We had to give them almost like a master class of this particular program to showcase the principles of what it is that we wanted to do, so they could use the same narratives. So as they were engaging with the leaders, as they were engaging with the consultants, the same narratives would actually emerge. So the essence of change management I think is just so fundamental in understanding from the outset exactly what the depth, what the depth should be. And also when we had the consultation on this particular project, we had quite a few detractors, old school leaders who made the most noise with L&D, who designed their own internal program, who thought that it had value and it had no value. So you also had quite a lot of detractors. And if you don't take the time to actually change the mindsets of those detractors, they are going to be grudge purchases and they never, ever, ever are going to drive your intent.
I have a follow-up question, but
Okay. Let's do it.
First, when you think of academic research at PhD level, usually there is a big element of which is contribution to the knowledge base.
Yes.
So now for your research, what is the gap that you have identified that you feel? And then also maybe provide clarity in terms of your research problem and your aim.
Okay. So maybe I'll start off with my research problem and the aim. Yeah. So when one actually looks at the research problem in this context, is really around changing the mindsets of your individuals from volume to value, using applied learning methodology and creating a sustainable business case for the organization in order to meet their market share. Okay, the aim is in essence to interrogate, the components of enablement. Okay, so that one actually can see that sustainability emerges, and then I would say sector-wise, it almost becomes a principle of a learning methodology or learning principles as such. And then your other question was the gap with the knowledge. I didn't get that.
At PhD level,
Yes.
usually at a PhD level, you tend to, one of the key contributions of a PhD or of a doctorate is actually to contribute to the broader knowledge base.
Yeah.
So what do you think is
My contribution.
either the significance or
Yes.
major contribution of your study
Yeah.
to the broader knowledge base?
Yeah. So I thought about that, and I think it goes back to my response at Sepo, in that looking at the broader knowledge base, it's about looking at the behavioral factors that influence a workforce through a holistic capability. And that is my contribution from a knowledge point of view, because it's an end-to-end solution. It looks at the entire value chain, whereas what currently is available are just aspects of the value chain, and that's been interrogated. So I'm looking at it from a quite holistic point of view and bringing in, that depth of new knowledge.
Okay. Consider. Yes, sir?
Maybe to continue from previous question, from academic point of view, and the PhD in particular, it's very critical that you demonstrate knowledge enhancement or
Yes.
knowledge contribution or the board of knowledge. And there are 4 sets of knowledge areas, okay, which is explanatory, descriptive, transformative, and prescriptive.
Yes.
I've listened to your presentation and I'm also a bit mixed up. Okay. Your problem area may be okay, but your research questions, they don't seem to be linking up your research objectives and as well as motivation or motive. And I was interested in knowing the methodology. It sounds more of a mixed method approach you're going to use, okay? you spoke of a contextual framework. Okay? So my concern is you're looking at the executives, you're also looking at the middle management, and you're looking at the front end. Okay? To me, that broadens your scope of research. All right? But it sounds more that your contribution will be more towards coming up with a framework, okay, that needs to be applied to achieve what you said, changing from volume to value, if I'm correct. But for that to stand the academic rigor, I don't think just having it from one case will be sufficient, because you need to test this framework out there. So you might need another case to test this framework.
I'm willing to take that, that debate further with the academic council, because they've never, I think it's the manner in which I define the problem statement. So using one case study was not the issue, based on the fact that when I looked at the research in terms of PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, etc., this problem statements in terms of banks in South Africa holistically were very similar. So it's not really solving for one specific organization. Every organization wants to, grab market share. Every organization wants to create client loyalty. Every organization wants to use their front line in order to do so. And it's how you actually enable that matters. So I'm willing, I've taken that note. It's an interesting view, right? So, I would have that conversation with Brunel. Just in terms of the principles around academic, it is an exploratory, piece of work. So I'm doing it's because when one looks at actual behavior, you need to look at it from an interpretative lens. Okay. And there are multiple realities in this situation, because you're testing culture, you're testing behavior, so there will be multiple realities in the environment of a social science capability. And for me, it's about how I'm engaging in terms of the human experience, and I'm testing the reality. So whose reality is it that that's out there, and how it is that I'm testing it. So it's really very, very strongly around an exploratory basis. It is not a mixed methodology. It is very specific in terms of it being qualitative. I am using the other aspect just in terms of my sample selection. So it is a qualitative research paper.
I think Indira, to your point, the double case study or having a second case study will just strengthen it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what's very important perhaps to consider is that the sample group that you have is relevant to the banking industry, so that it represents the banking industry well, because if it doesn't, then you can't take it out.
Exactly.
You want to take it out.
Yes, very
so I
much
think it's very important you look at the relevance.
Yes, and I appreciate that,
Representativeness,
Mark.
shall I say.
Yeah, no, for sure, because I think added to what you're saying, to sort of build credibility on the one case study, is that the sample group also is multi-channeled. So it's contact center, it is individuals, in the branch environment.
And there's your representativeness.
And that's my representativeness, yes, very much so, yes.
Oh yeah.
Why not quantitative? I just want to understand, because I just picked up on you mentioning themes.
Yes.
And wouldn't themes be easier to do with data? And then the second question I had was, in terms of ROI, I was just wondering, wouldn't lower staff turnover rates be something that you can measure this on? Surely after something like this has been implemented, if I'm understanding your study correctly, and it's been followed through, then you'll see a lower staff turnover, or is that not really a focus for you in the study? But I was just thinking that would be a way to measure it.
I think ultimately it would be one measure, but that would be more of a medium-term measure, Tanya.
Okay.
So from a timing point of view, I wouldn't actually be able to incorporate it into the measurements. I think for me the most important is to actually test for the behavioral changes. So are people starting to think differently about how they engage their clients? Are they educating their clients? Are they more solution-driven than product-driven? Are they using the right narratives? Is their leaders actually enabling, and is the leader supporting them in that context? So that's the reality. Why I haven't used quantitative analysis is that what data feeds do I actually get from a sample of this nature? So remember, you're looking at a cohort of about 1,000 people who've been through this initiative, and you're looking for participation. So I wouldn't know which, there's no benchmark from a quantitative perspective in order to actually do sampling.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a very big sample group for a qualitative study.
It is, and the reason why I specifically chose such a big sample group was because I was using a case study, and I wanted it to be representative. So even if I get sort of 60% participation, it would still be a credible sample size to be a representative sample.
You probably have to look at some quantitative data that will feed, although you're going to stick with qualitative, because in qualitative you can use quantitative data. And some of that quantitative data would be things around your culture survey, your staff engagement, your turnaround, your absenteeism rates, because all those kind of things are indicators as to whether learning has happened. And just in terms of the sample that you're going to use, I used to head up the corporate university for MTM. And one of the things we looked at was something we called matrix that matters, because we were doing all this traditional learning, but it was just not bringing any value back to the organization. So what we did was we implemented something called matrix that matters. So we do the normal survey with staff that say, I've been on this training and I've applied it. But more importantly, if it's a return on investment point of view, then you want to test the effectiveness of learning and the application of learning from the line manager. So I would have sent a sample to the line manager to say that, and periodically over a period of time to say that somebody went on this course on X date. 2 months later, has there been a change? Has there been a change? Has there been a change? Because that would give you far more concrete data on whether the learning has actually been applied and effective. Because from the learner point of view, I might say, yes, I've done it, but really what's tangible about that from the other side?
Yeah. So
you can share that.
Absolutely, you're spot on. I appreciate that. So I don't know if you would recall, I spoke about triangulation. So the triangulation is really around how the learner has digested this particular intervention and how have they applied it. And then the leader, how has the leader digested, applied it, and enabled it. And then the other bit is, is the organization, so what have the entrenched sales been? So is there an increase or decrease in entrenched sales? And what has the wastage been? Because so that would be the yes. So I'm not doing quantitative research in terms of the research gathering. I'm taking that and I'm triangulating it to the results as such. Because I have to your point. I think if I don't triangulate it, it doesn't have substance.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have the depth that I'm looking for.
So when you started, you spoke about the future of banking. You spoke about the trends that are happening in banking. Now, in your research, my question is, I didn't hear you mention how this will be delivered. So, fast forward to 2020 when banks or branches are no longer reported and maybe staff's employees are doing different things. Wouldn't it be interesting to find out, for me personally, to say, how will this training be delivered? The platform that will be used, the channels that will be used. They're still going to be traditional, or do you envisage at the end of this to say this
A component of digital and different,
in how it will be delivered at that time?
So for the purpose of this particular work stream, I'm testing a sort of a program that is being developed to solve for the problem statement, and it's actually then being executed as such. So it's not sort of, it's not dealt from a future point of view. What could arise when I do my research? People may say that, we don't believe that this program should have only had a classroom component or something to that effect, and we'd like to see something, from a digital platform. That could actually emerge from the actual research. And then I would explore it, but I wouldn't think in the future for the context of what this paper is about, to really then start exploring digital capability in the learning environment, because I think that's a completely different topic. But should that theme emerge, then I most certainly will dive into it.
Okay, cool. Indira, I don't know if maybe I missed it, maybe in the interaction. What is your bias in this research?
So I think I come with a whole lot of biasness because of my ontological positioning. And I mean, I'm very deliberate about taking a very objective view, stepping back and not bringing in my own ideologies. And that's the reason why I'm specifically getting a whole lot of field researchers to actually help with the research. And that would mitigate my biasness. So I do. I mean, I do have absolutely. I come because I've managed big businesses. I know about the experiences I've had with L&D. I've been in boardrooms. I know what the difficult conversations are, and I'm trying to be very objective about it. And what's helping me is bringing in the academic flavor, because the academic flavor then actually mitigates a lot of my biasness as well, because I'm having to critically evaluate, different philosophies and different theories.
Okay, brilliant. Indira, thank you so much.